Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 40 of Truth is Justice.
So in our time, we must move on from the reassuring repetition of stale phrases to a new, difficult, but essential confrontation with reality. For the great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. Too often we hold fast to the cliches of our forebears. We subject all facts to a prefabricated set of interpretations. We enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. Mythology distracts us everywhere.
That was John F. Kennedy during his commencement speech at Yale University on the 11th of June 1962. I find the whole speech incredibly powerful, but that particular section that I just played has real relevance and power, not just because of the person speaking those words, but because of the time when they were spoken and the relevance they have today to so much of what we see. And listen to it again, the message from it. The words that the great enemy isn't the lie, it is the myth. I encourage you to skip back now and listen to it again if you have a chance, or if you want to listen to the whole thing, do a YouTube search for JFK commencement speech at Yale University. This particular section starts at about the 5-minute, 30-second mark. I heard these words again recently, and it hit me how powerful what we do here at Truth is Justice is. I'm not saying that with an ego. Those that know me, that is so far from the truth. I don't mean what I do personally or what I say. I mean what we represent and what the people who contribute on our Facebook page and those that offer up material, insight and contributions directly to us. It's powerful what is offered up by way of rational thought, critical analysis and objective consideration of the material. We don't just blindly accept a rumour as fact, despite the attempts by many groups to have you do just that. We put pressure on those rumours, we question them and see if they hold up. Most times, as we saw time and time again in the Melgar case, with comments made by Bob that were offered up as fact, they were all rumour and they almost all had no basis in reality. A post was put up recently by one of our Facebook group members which sought to create a list of all the rumours that had since been proven to be just myth and rumour, not fact. That was a brilliant post and a fantastic idea. Accordingly, and deservedly, it was received very well, and I think it actually represents an excellent framework for matters to be considered in this age of true crime podcasts. In fact, that process of fact-checking, the setting the record straight, that's what we are all about here. Look back over everything we've done. That has been exactly what we have done. That process of taking a claim offered up as fact and seeing if it really is fact. And that process has been truly powerful. Powerful formally in what was achieved over the last year in terms of insight into the case and the discovery of many pieces of evidence that had not been previously identified, but also powerful in terms of representing a voice for those individuals who were unable or unwilling to respond to vicious verbal attacks and efforts to deeply negatively impact their lives. What we have done has been powerful in injecting reality into a space that seems to be more interested in creating dramatisation akin to daytime TV soaps and pushing sponsors than it does the truth. We have a lot of new listeners at the moment. For those of you that don't know the facts of the Melgar case, bear with me. I'm not sure what episode it is. Actually, it was likely many of them, but there was one specifically where we ran through a list of the items relating to Bob's interview with Ms. Barnett. Things like the knife blade length, the number of TVs in the house, the view of the master bedroom closet from the jacuzzi. And Bob made little comments on each of those points, and several others, with one purpose, being to get his listeners to view Ms. Barnett in a particular way. He was asking them, well, not really asking them, he was convincing them without them knowing exactly what he was doing. It's my strong opinion that he was purposefully manipulating them into taking a view that Ms. Barnett was not to be trusted. Now that was a powerful tactic, and it was essential. Actually, it was a critical approach for Bob to sell the idea that Sandra Melgar was innocent of murdering her husband, Jaime. He had to set up the villain, and he had to convince his audience that she was deceitful. As I highlighted back in that episode, and many others since, each of the points Bob raised were wrong. Not just subjectively inaccurate, completely and utterly wrong. Bob either made it up because he didn't know what was right and wanted to take an opposing position to the prosecutor, or he knew it was wrong and was lying about it because he had to do that for the purposes of his show and setting up a narrative of a wrongful conviction. Remember, his show is all about wrongful convictions. It is deeply anti-state and anti-prosecution specifically. Setting the prosecutor up as a villain is crucial, and his income relies on that. I'll come back to the importance of that income element in a little while. If you get a chance, go back and have a listen to one or two of Bob's earliest episodes, when he operated as Serial Dynasty. A little side note, many of Bob's most passionate fans like to be critical of our podcast because they feel our name is an attempt to ride on Bob's coattails. And not many of them have any concept of the history of Bob's own show whilst making those criticisms, but that's okay. Yes, our name's a little cheeky, but I don't care. It got people talking. So, back to the earlier episodes. If you get a chance, go and listen to episode 2 of Bob's podcast. All of it, if you can stand it, or from about the 21-minute mark to about the 28-minute mark. I'll quote portions of it here for those who don't want to go back and listen to it. Note also that the first episode has been updated in the sense that an intro has been newly added to try and bring context to the content, given how much of it has changed and the economic engine that it has become for Bob. People often go back and criticise our first episode. Again, I don't care. It was the first podcast episode I had ever done. It took me a long time to get comfortable with even listening back to my own voice and then doing the editing. No other context was or is necessary, and I'll keep that episode exactly as it is, as a memory of how it all started. Now, if you challenge us on our name or on our content, go back and listen to the first few minutes of the first episode of Bob's show. So, here we go. And to steal the words from Bob, let's go along for the ride. Enjoy. Specifically, let's listen to Bob's take on how you can convince people of a particular position. This is his episode 2 from about 21 minutes in. So to quote from Bob, "We see all of the witnesses in this case changing their stories constantly, almost every single one of them. What may be seemingly unimportant witnesses, they change their stories. What I am looking at is why the change. This is what I'm in my mind 100% certain what is going on. I believe the detectives, McGilvery and Ritz, were bullying these witnesses. Not necessarily bullying, but manipulating these witnesses. I also believe the prosecutor, Urich, was doing the same thing. So how is this done? How is this done? How are all of these witnesses flip-flopping, changing their minds like that? You have to put yourself back in the mindset of being a 17, 18-year-old high school kid. I don't know what the term is, I'm sure there is one for it, but the long and short of it is, it's really not that difficult to manipulate somebody's thoughts and memories. It doesn't take much at all, especially for a young, impressionable kid. Let me give you an example. And Bob then goes on to give an example of an experiment he tried on 2 fellow firefighters he worked with. These 2 guys were in their 20s, a point that Bob makes suggesting that their age and Bob's position as fire chief were elements in being able to manipulate them into thinking a particular way. The demonstration proceeds like this. They went out to lunch, and whilst having lunch, Bob set the plan in motion. It takes Bob a little while to work through the demonstration, but basically he describes how he was able to manipulate the memory of those 2 fellow firefighters that were with him at lunch that day. In fact, that is exactly how Bob describes it, and to quote him, he was manipulating someone's mind. He notes how, if you can put a few ideas in someone's mind, he says that, and I'm not paraphrasing here, he notes how, if you present details that people had not paid attention to, you can completely change their train of thought. Bob then starts playing his games with his fellow firefighters. He starts with a guilt trip on them about the size of the tip they gave, and then moves on to, as Bob describes, planting details in the heads of those firefighters that work for him. Again, Bob's description about planting details, not mine. In fact, Bob even describes how the manipulation of those two fellow workers was done as an experiment for the show, but also noting that he enjoys doing it to his younger co-workers anyway. So, Bob starts dropping to these fellow firefighters little details about the waitress, well, supposed details about the waitress, including that she has 3 children at home, with Bob pointing to a non-existent badge the waitress was wearing that had an image of her 3 children on it. He then expanded on that story. He added that she was a single mum, noting that she wasn't wearing a wedding ring, a lie, but one that Bob proudly describes convincing 2 fellow firefighters of, in the name of the podcast. He continues with making the fellow firefighters feel ashamed for not knowing the waitress's name because of her name tag. Again, another bit of fiction, but proving Bob's point that he can manipulate those 2 fellow co-workers into taking on his point of view. Bob notes how it was amazing watching both of them start to remember details like name tags that didn't actually exist. They believed it, they remembered it, only because Bob kept pushing a false narrative. Bob notes how he revealed the true story only when the 2 fellow workers were insisting on driving back the 20 miles to the restaurant to pay a greater tip to the waitress. He notes that the 2 firefighters are still upset with him to this day for that stunt. Now, Bob concludes the example by making the point that, contrary to what he had presented, there was no button on the waitress's shirt and no name tag, and her name was different to what Bob suggested, and she may or may not have had a wedding ring on. But by the end of the conversation, in their mind, the mind of the 2 fellow firefighters, they were remembering details that never happened but only came to life because Bob completely made them up. And to quote Bob again, and this gives some valuable insight, by throwing in a little bit of guilt, I was able to completely manipulate their minds. So what's the relevance? Why am I bringing this up? It isn't to dispute the reality or validity of what Bob did. That approach very much exists. People can be convinced of all sorts of things that have no basis in reality and that are purely rumour and myth. Think about what we have covered over the last 40 episodes. We've addressed lies, manipulation, misinformation, the whole gamut. Bob threw everything at the case, without any regard for the validity of what he was offering up. He didn't seem to care whether it was the truth. He definitely didn't go back and seek to correct any misstatements. In fact, even when we called him out to do exactly that, he wouldn't budge. His position from day one was absolutely clear, and it was absolutely what we have said from the start of this podcast. The facts and details didn't matter. Bob wanted to present a wrongful conviction podcast about Sandra Melgar, and he was going to do so whether the case material and the evidence as a whole supported that or not. He was, in essence, drawing on those same skills he described back in episode 2. But this time, he was using those skills not to manipulate a couple of fellow firefighters, but to manipulate an entire audience for the purposes of generating an income, with complete disregard, not just for the people involved in the investigation, prosecution, and the legal process of Sandra's conviction, but of Jaime himself. Under the highly dubious claim of being about justice for Jaime, the podcast turned into a money maker that is far more accurately described as the Free Sandy Show. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit more about our income model. Well, our no income model is more apt a description. We make no income here. To be clear, we're not a non-profit in the sense that we have no net income, we have no gross income, nothing. We operate at a financial loss and have done so since day one. I don't mind that approach, and I'll explain the reasons why in a little bit. But first, to expand on the reasons behind our approach. When I started this podcast, my initial thought was that not having sponsors would add to our credibility. Not that I had any intention of starting a podcast for the purposes of generating sponsor income anyway, but I truly believed that people would find the message more believable because I wasn't being paid to say it. I say that, meaning because of both the lack of sponsors and also the general underlying message that we were communicating. So in Bob's case, the underlying message of a wrongful conviction and everything that goes with that should very much be considered in the context of it representing a for-profit activity. And make no mistake, this true crime realm is highly lucrative. The amount of money changing hands is significant if you take the right approach. Not necessarily a truth approach, in fact, often not, or at least you can claim you're taking a truth approach, but actually take a dramatic approach. Now, on the sponsors, it's important for me to explain why we don't run ads, at least what the motivation and thinking behind that is. For those that know me through this podcast, the Facebook page and through direct messages, you'd know that I'm passionate, absolutely passionate about the truth. When Bob was making claims on his show that were so obviously wrong, lies, or simply Bob just not having the capacity to distinguish the truth from rumour, I had to speak up. Many of you know the evolution of that. I spoke up politely and with respect, but that didn't fit well with the message of the show, the wrongful conviction message. So after a little while, I was removed from the page with the comment that I should start my own podcast if I wanted to share those thoughts. I was so passionate about the truth and defending those who are largely unable to defend themselves that is exactly what I did. I started this podcast. Now, Addy did up the graphic designs that you see. I started the website, populated it with the case material, and I began to break down each and every episode that Bob presented, calling out each and every one of the lies. Now, as I said earlier, it wasn't like many of those were subjective. They were obviously factually incorrect statements. So you could say, and you would be right, that I'm someone who is passionate about the truth and willing to speak out to support those views. One of the things I hate the most is hearing a statement presented as fact, especially when, sometimes just 10 seconds of research proves that it isn't a fact. So that passion for the truth feeds into my views on sponsorship. When George Clooney advertises coffee, I don't consciously think that I'll buy that coffee because George must be one of the most knowledgeable people in the world on what the best coffee for me is. But that message is still expressed, and it probably still gets through to me in some way. We actually have 2 Nespresso machines, so that says something about the power of advertising. Now, I've seen firsthand how people can be swayed by an opinion, a comment presented as fact, when in reality there is no truth to it at all. Bob was skilled at presenting something as fact that sometimes didn't even exist. He knew that a large portion of his audience would accept that comment as fact, and through repetition and the frenzy of people to come up with elements to support some often absurd conclusions, the fact was well and truly ingrained in the narrative. And building the website, the ongoing hosting, setting up the podcast, the mic, more drives, etc., all took money and time. Such was, and is, my passion for the truth. I was, and I continue to be, happy to cover those costs. But those efforts are not just mine. There is a team of people behind me. Many of you who are members of our Facebook group will know this already. But there are passionate people who keep this whole operation going. Have a glance around some other true crime podcast websites and the way their Facebook pages are maintained. I don't think many of them spend the amount of time and effort that we do in making their websites easily accessible and making given case material easy to digest. Now, it wouldn't be a stretch, and forgive me if it is, but it wouldn't be a stretch to say that what we do and how we do it is truly in a league of its own. The presentation of the case material on our website, the admin and modding of our Facebook page, it's largely unequalled as far as I can see. People take offence to that, especially people who would rather particular matters remain fully controlled by a small group of people and access to supporting material heavily restricted, as is the case with the Andreacchio matter. Think about all of that in the context of costs. I sat down yesterday and went through the amount of time spent on this project by those around me, those supporting this project. The amount of time spent on it on an ongoing basis is beyond the weekly working hours of a full-time position. And then you add in the time spent by me on preparing the podcast, uploading material to the website, etc. We're not talking an insignificant amount of resources going into this. As many of you would know, the way to support these efforts, the way used by almost all true crime podcasts, is to run ads. There is a very simple primary reason why I don't like that approach. Trust. How can you possibly trust me to tell you about a product, and many of the sales spiels are done in such a way that the presenter speaks from their supposed first-hand knowledge of the product? How can you possibly trust me to tell you about that product when I'm being paid by the maker of the product to tell you about it? Actually, you can go one step further. How could you trust what I was saying if I relied on that advertiser income to put food on the table? You couldn't, surely. Have a think about free products that you might have ever received, especially ones that had a higher net value. If the provider of those free products asked for your opinion and offered to pay you a considerable sum of money on an ongoing basis to speak about them, what do you think you'd say? Now, there are multiple aspects to that whole scenario. I'll let you tease them out in detail for yourself, but as a guide, think about what that means in terms of what I, and we here at Truth is Justice, what we say. We're not saying things to receive dollars. We're not saying things to take advantage of families who may be struggling to accept a particular situation and willing to pay money to receive advice that supports their claim narrative. We are just after the truth. Another reason that I'm against ads is, as I've highlighted, I'm passionate about the truth and being truthful. I simply couldn't sell you a product that I didn't believe in. Actually, I probably couldn't sell you a product that I did believe in. I'm not really a salesperson. I hear other podcast hosts sell a variety of products, and sometimes you'll catch them out, unwittingly contradicting themselves on an episode with respect to their comments about a given product. Now, I'm not against podcasts like this making money. Not at all. And I don't think that necessarily means what they are saying and doing is false or lacks credibility because of that fact. What is important, though, is to remember that when your livelihood revolves around running a show that has an audience chomping at the bit for action on a wrongful conviction, the outcome is never going to be anything other than giving them what they want. To think otherwise is ludicrous, in my opinion. So, for those reasons, the decision was made by us to not run ads. Now, I quite like the idea of a supporter-paid model like Patreon for some premium content, but in being completely honest with you, we are so passionate about transparency and making everything available that I can't actually think of an angle that would make direct supporters of us through Patreon or something similar receive the value that they would deserve for parting with their hard-earned dollars. I can't think of premium content that we don't simply want everyone to have access to. The best material we have, the best conversations, etc., they're free, and they will always be free. That is absolutely fundamental to our approach and will not change. Perhaps naively, I believe this approach of not having sponsors would add a level of trust to the way we present things, that the audience and consumers of our information via the website and Facebook would be able to trust our presentation of the material on the basis that no money was being made from it. And maybe it does for some, or even many people. However, I saw a post several weeks ago that mentioned us here at Truth is Justice, and it commented that we were exploiting the death of Christian Andreacchio. Importantly, and I mentioned this in the last episode, that comment offered up a hashtag of the Culpable podcast. And again, that hashtag was added in that very same comment. And a reminder that the Culpable podcast is a for-profit podcast, which is run by selling ads. By definition, it is exploiting the death of Christian Andreacchio to make money. But presumably, because the show was produced and presented in a way sympathetic to a particular group's narrative, rather than necessarily looking at the truth, such exploitation is seemingly not just allowed by those with passionate views on Christian's death representing murder, but actively encouraged. The more media attention, the better, it seems. Well, importantly, as long as that media attention aligns with their narrative and is strictly controlled. Now, how can you look at the material presented by that group, by the Culpable podcast, in the same way? One group, being us, uploads everything we have. Alright, some things are still in the process of going up, but redacting a 1500 plus page phone extract takes a bit of time. So one group does that, being us, and then on top of that, we ask people to contribute any further information if they have it. The other group, well, groups, offer up very little. In fact, going back to JFK, they simply offer up rumour, and they wrap it up as fact. And that is so very, very dangerous. Now, we're used to those claims of exploitation. Similar comments have been offered up by the family of Sandra Melgar, and either those people are not aware that we don't make money from this, or they do know and they simply want to reject the truth. My suspicion is that they, and this is directed at those relating to both the Melgar case and the Andreacchio matter, who are so against transparency and a rational consideration of the evidence, that they are so threatened by the truth and so threatened by our approach that they have no option but to attack us in whatever way they can. Attack me, attack the quality of my microphone or my failure to share a detailed backstory on my life, anything to distract from the threat of what we do. Now, I mentioned in episode 39 that this would be our last Melgar episode. Now, that isn't completely accurate. My understanding is that Ms. Zellner is going to continue with the case. At least, that is what the occasional Twitter post seems to indicate. Whilst I'm eagerly awaiting the scenario of how the egos of Ms. Zellner and Mr. Seacrest are able to work side by side, I'm anticipating the angles that they will try to continue to profit from the murder of Jaime by Sandra. My anticipation, and that of others, is that the DNA evidence from that case will be used to try and seek Sandra's acquittal. We will not let those arguments go unconsidered or not responded to. Meaning, if arguments are presented that unknown female number 1 is a mystery female connected to, a mafia crime mob operating out of Florida, or an international spy, or a waitress at a restaurant, we will dedicate as much time as is necessary to explaining why the unknown female number 1 results are almost undeniably those of Liz. Now, some of you will jump on my description of that, saying, almost undeniably. I'll be even clearer. The results would be so fundamentally shocking to the world of forensic DNA if Liz is not the contributor of unknown female number 1 that it would turn science on its head, and DNA results generally, even those which have exonerated wrongful convictions, would be brought into doubt. So, here are my thoughts, because I don't think I've been necessarily clear on them up to this point. Sandra Melgar is almost certainly exactly where she belongs. I can't rule out that aliens killed Jaime with absolute certainty, but I can, with enough certainty, to know that Sandra took the life of her husband of 32 years. Those of you that have followed us for some time know our approach and our methodology. It would be impossible to rule out, by the criteria that many wrongful conviction advocates argue, that aliens or international spies or a chef with a vendetta and an irregularity on one of his kitchen knives killed Jaime. But we can say, with a very high level of certainty, entirely beyond reasonable doubt, that Sandra killed Jaime. If you haven't yet had a chance, I'd encourage you to read the appeal decision made by the Court of Appeals and released on the 7th of January 2020. I highly recommend it. It makes for easy reading. It's only 19 pages and it gives you a good overview of the case, and specifically, it gives you a brilliant understanding of the role of the jury. If you take only one thing away from it, hopefully it's this. The jury members are tasked with a very difficult job. Even that description is an understatement of some magnitude. They have the immense task of assessing all of the material in front of them, weighing up the different arguments presented and the different interpretations of evidence offered, and arriving at a decision. To say that a jury should interpret a piece of evidence one specific way, sympathetic to the defence, represents a complete misunderstanding of the function of a jury trial. Of course, defence counsel will present an argument on a given piece of evidence that appears at least plausible. That's their function. They would be deficient in their duties if they didn't. Importantly, what the jury members must do is consider each element of evidence as a single piece of a bigger picture. The interpretation then has to make sense, meaning you can't apply one set of logic to one piece of evidence and another contradictory set of logic to another piece of evidence to make each piece work. And that's exactly the approach that shows like Bob's, and I think it's reasonable to say even Culpable and Wow, intentionally avoid. They consistently apply different, contradictory arguments to different pieces of evidence and claim that is the appropriate way to view evidence. They take a small element, something they believe is critical to their narrative, and apply certain parameters to how that element should be considered. And that approach didn't have a place in the Melgar case, and it will not have a place in the Andreacchio matter, or any case for that matter. As soon as you argue a point that requires multiple contradictions and is completely inconsistent with even the parameters you apply to other elements that you twist to support your narrative, you're only attempting to fool people, not to get closer to the truth. Now, there's far more information behind the scenes on the Melgar case that I tried, but simply wasn't able to work out a way to present without causing problems for those individuals involved. Many of you will remember those comments by Ms. Barnett about the possible marital problems being experienced by Jaime and Sandra. Those comments are almost certainly true. I don't say that because of any information provided by Ms. Barnett. I say that because with a little bit of research, multiple individuals close to the Melgars who knew the Melgars would attest directly to that. And why didn't they appear here? Why am I not quoting them? For the sake of their best interests, really. And Bob and some of his most passionate supporters often point proudly to the fact that many people don't speak up against their narratives and their interpretations. That the reason for that is because their narratives and interpretations are correct. And the reality couldn't be any more different. Some of the most passionate supporters can become relentless and vicious in their anger at anyone daring to speak out against them. That is true both of what we experienced in the Melgar case and what we are experiencing now in the Andreacchio matter. The bottom line is this: Sandra is exactly where she deserves to be, and I know the way her passionate supporters react to anyone speaking out. The threats that are made are real, and they're frequent. Now, did Bob delve into some of these other opinions on the relationship between Sandra and Jaime? I don't know, but you can assess it either way. Either Bob did know about those views of the relationship between Sandra and Jaime and chose not to disclose it, or he didn't know about it, and that was simply because he didn't do his homework. Either way, not great evidence to point to with respect to a thorough reinvestigation, as Bob claims. Except, of course, if he wanted it to be a reinvestigation with a given outcome, in which case it was absolutely spot on. Now, if you wanted to convince people of a particular position, if you wanted to manipulate their minds, as Bob puts it, then the way Bob did it is exactly the right way. I'll raise a few very brief points here for those of you that want to further your own understanding of the details behind elements of the Melgar case. We can continue discussions of this in the Facebook page. The first one. Look closely at the YouTube comments on videos relating to the Melgar case put up by others. Doing that will give you a very interesting insight into how Sandra and Jaime were viewed as a couple and individually. Some of the videos have lots of comments, but I'd encourage you to scroll right down. And the second point. Look closely at some of those people involved in aspects of the Melgars' lives. There is very much a situation of entangled connections linking not only Liz's malpractice suit, which was finalised a short time before Jaime's murder, but the management of the rental properties and the purchase of the College Station house, for example. And the third one. Look closely at the timing and circumstances surrounding the claims made against Jaime's brother, Erwin, and ask yourself, what were the reasons for such a swift turn on an immediate family member of Jaime's? And finally, consider this. Your husband of 32 years is brutally murdered. You claim you had nothing to do with it, and in the days, not weeks, months or years, but the days after his death, you destroy, so permanently erase from the world, many of his possessions. They seemingly meant that little, that the possessions of a man that it has been described was wholly passionate about his record keeping and his treasured items, that those possessions were destroyed by his immediate family less than 100 hours after his death. Now, to go back to the words from JFK, it is the myth that is the danger, and that is exactly what we are here to address. We look forward to you joining us next week as we commence our look at the Andreacchio matter. You might have thoughts on the case, you may have heard rumours, whether they be from other podcasts, Facebook groups or Christians' family members. What we will try to do is demonstrate whether those rumours are supported by facts and supported by the evidence, or whether they're simply stories designed to support a fictional narrative entirely unsupported by fact or evidence. It's going to be a very interesting process. And you can join us as we continue to set the record straight by contributing to our Facebook page at Truth is Justice. And I look forward to interacting with you there.